right, excellent. So what we're doing in the remaining couple weeks of the course, we're getting pretty close to the end after today. I think we've got 2 more weeks of class pretty much. We're going to try to challenge Taylor's initial sort of framework that he gave us a little bit by moving outside of the Western context and especially moving outside the Christian context. Pretty much everything we've talked about up to this point has assumed that in some sense or another, the definition of religion includes within itself some sort of reference to what Taylor calls this transcendent, right? You could say God or supernatural beings. Many of you have put it in those terms in the paper, right? And so therefore there's a sharp and obvious contrast between religion on the one hand and sort of not being religious on the other, where the not religion is people who deny that there's a transcendent reality, right? That way of talking indeed characterizes Christianity reasonably well, especially Protestant Christianity, but even Catholicism characterizes that reasonably well. It might not apply anywhere near so well once we leave the Western context. And to say that sort of the essence of Buddhism has something to do with transcendence maybe is misleading. What we're going to discover is sort of a different account of religion. And again, there's not even really a word, right? Religion is indeed a Western European word. But like things we would be prone to call religions, like for example, Islam, get characterized not as religions in the Western sense, but rather get characterized as ways of life more broadly. A sort of totalizing entire orientation of both an individual person, but then the individual person is situated within a broader community, so also the orientation of the community as a whole. And from this way of talking, it's not really going to make sense to talk about people as not being religious. Everyone's going to be religious, i.e. everyone's going to be living some way of life in some community that allows for and promotes that way of life. But some of those ways of life are just going to look radically different from one another, right? And some may well be good and some may well be bad, right? I mean, the claim here that, for example, that Al-Ghazali is going to make very straightforwardly in other places is that, people who were pagans, we can't really blame them for being pagans because they just didn't know any better. They're kind of just dumb, right? They should have been Muslims if they had actually wanted to have been happy, but that was not possible for them because Muhammad hadn't even been born yet and God hadn't chosen to spoken through them yet, right? So it sort of sucks to be them, but yeah, they just had a bad way of life, is what he literally says of them. They just had a bad way of life because they didn't know anything better. Right? And that's what he says about Christians and Jews too. He says, they're just like bad. They just like aren't living the best way of life. They're necessarily unhappy, and this will have very serious sort of ramifications for them down the road. So this is what we're going to look at. We've been looking at talking about this in the context of Islam. We're going to do the same thing next week. We're going to look at this and talk about this in the terms of Buddhism and the different kinds of Buddhism. We'll have the same sort of discussion in that arena too next week. And maybe I'll throw in some Confucianism too, because Confucianism is another thing that most of you probably think of as a religion that doesn't really fit Taylor's account of what a religion is really at all. But it is indeed very clearly a way of life. Right? And an articulation of a way of life without any particular discussion of a transcendent source or requirements of transcendence or anything of that sort. So hopefully by the end of this sort of last couple weeks of the course for your last paper, right, those of you who've been pushing hard the transcendence line, I'm not saying you're wrong, but now you'll at least have a view to argue against. You'll be able to argue against this other view that the other way of articulating religion that doesn't do it in terms of transcendence at all. That's the goal. We should now get sort of an alternative to the Taylor account. All right. So that's the plan. That's the plan for the remaining, week, two and a half weeks or so left of the course. Final paper, then we'll probably try to get the rubric out for the final paper sometime next week. It'll be due during the final exam period itself, so you should have a good 3 weeks or so to work on it. And that's pretty much it for the rest of the semester. So. Before we get started, does anyone have any thoughts or questions on anything? Anything they'd like to go over? All right. Excellent. Then let's just begin by reviewing last class with Al-Farabi. Right, let's just review what he had to say. And Al-Farabi's account My hope was that you would all find it shocking, and from our class discussion last time, it seemed like people did. You all seemed to be quite properly sort of like intrigued and sort of horrified by the account that Al-Farabi was giving, and indeed this is entirely right. So Al-Farabi is a Islamic theologian. He's influenced obviously and heavily by Platonic and Neoplatonic sources. He makes no sort of hidden claim about that. He's very straightforward about it. His claim is that religion is opinion and action prescribed by a lawgiver in order for the community to attain a specific purpose. So really, anytime you have any kind of organized community, you therefore have some kind of religion, because within that community, there will be certain kinds of opinions and actions that get prescribed. Now, are the right actions getting prescribed, or are they getting prescribed for the right reasons? That's an entirely separate question. But every community is, by definition, in Al-Farabi's account, a religious community, at least any organized community, right? Any purposeful or deliberative community. All right. So what's the specific purpose? Well, the specific purpose is happiness, right? That is the goal of religion. The goal of religion is human happiness. And do you want to say, do I mean human happiness in this life or the next? Yes, both, right? It almost doesn't even matter. The goal is happiness. Now, a true religion, a virtuous religion, a good religion, one that gets it right, there the purpose is what actual happiness consists in, right? So this requires sort of a knowledge claim, right? The virtuous religion is sort of ruled over by a lawgiver who actually knows what true human happiness actually consists with him. And as far as Al-Farabi is concerned, coming from his Platonic background and also coming from his Islamic background, right, the true happiness will indeed, on his view, make some reference to God and a transcendent source. But there are indeed vicious and bad religions, right, ones that don't know what true happiness consists in, that instead sort of misidentifies happiness in various sort of other things and pursues those sort of misidentified forms of happiness instead of what real happiness is. So, for example, maybe, just pick one, I don't know, let's say out of a hat, maybe our community has decided that wealth is what human happiness consists within, right? And that happiness consists in having as much wealth as possible. A religion of that sort, a religion that was given by a lawmaker who had come to that sort of conclusion, is wrong, Al-Farabi thinks. They don't understand what true happiness consists in. But nevertheless, the true lawgiver organizes the community for the realization of that sort of mistaken goal, right? That goal of wealth. And indeed, depending on how corrupt or just how vicious this bad lawgiver actually is, either he's trying to just make himself really rich, right? So that would be a truly tyrannical form of government, where the only concerns that the lawgiver is concerned with is the happiness of the lawgiver himself, or, right, if it's just someone who's otherwise has a good, we'll put it this way, a good heart, or good spirit, a good motivation, right? They just got the specifics wrong. They try to make the entire community happy too, right? So in that case, they would try to make the entire community wealthy too, right? So to create as wealthy of a community as possible. How will the lawgiver do this? Well, by prescribing sort of various kinds of beliefs, both theoretical and practical beliefs, right, that will promote this idea of wealth in this case, and various actions, rules, and laws that are intended to promote this idea of wealth. And again, the virtuous religions, like the laws will have the same purpose, only it'll be promotion of actual happiness rather than just sort of theoretical happiness or sort of mistaken happiness. And indeed, that's what the distinctive characteristic is. Virtuous religion gets it right. That's all he basically means by a virtuous religion. A virtuous religion is one that gets human happiness right and prescribes the right things to realize that human happiness. As a result, he actually thinks it is possible that there could be many different virtuous religions, because what is necessary to attain human happiness in one place might be very different than what is necessary to attain human happiness in a different way. Right? You might need to tell different kinds of stories, or you might need to make different kinds of laws or different kinds of rules, depending on the various sort of circumstances that the citizens find themselves within. Right? But that's the goal. The goal is happiness. And the virtuous religion, that's the one that gets it right. But the virtuous religion doesn't give us demonstrative or scientific knowledge about these things, right? So if I belong to a virtuous religion, I will have true beliefs about the world, and I will engage in true actions that really do lead to human happiness. But I won't really know why. I'll maybe at best just know like that I believe true things, I might not even know that. I might just sort of be going about living my life in a really smart way, but not realize that I'm even doing it. Right? What gives scientific knowledge or demonstrative knowledge, according to Al-Farabi, is philosophy. Right? But the problem is most people can't do philosophy. It's too hard, and most people don't have enough time for it. Right? So what is virtuous religion doing? Virtuous religion is transcribing philosophical truth, the truth about human happiness, into a way that the general public is capable of understanding it. Right? So the religious leader tells myths, tells stories, they make laws, prescribe rules by which things will get praised and blamed, right? In a way that sort of is like carrying out philosophy. It's sort of like philosophy in action, in a sense, but without actually going through all of the difficult proofs and demonstrations. He calls it a kind of imagistic retelling of philosophy. And that means philosophy is not, is sort of the prior thing, right? Philosophy is sort of what defines what good religion says, right? And so as far as he's concerned, Muhammad was both a religious leader, he certainly is that, but he's also a philosopher, and he was a true statesman, a true political leader, right? Those three sort of functions all are part and parcel of the same thing. The religion is the politics, is the philosophy, right? And so Muhammad just was the preeminent philosopher, so he made the preeminently good religion and organized the preeminently good caliphate, the preeminently good sort of political organization. All right. So with all of this, right, Al-Farabi is not an orthodox Islamic thinker when he's talking about philosophy in this way, right? But everything else he's saying is pretty orthodox, and we're going to see that when we turn to now Al-Ghazali today. Al-Ghazali is almost like the archetypical orthodox Islamic thinker. He's one of the most important thinkers in Islam in its entirety. Right, after you get from the first generation from Muhammad, the first generation of Muhammad's direct disciples, Al-Ghazali is probably the next most important thinker. And he is not going to disagree with the basic picture here with anything except about how Al-Farabi is talking about religion. Right? Everything else Al-Ghazali is going to say is going to be pretty much in conformity with the account of religion that Al-Farabi is otherwise giving. All right. So that was just review from last class. So before we go any further, does anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments or anything just from that last class? Feeling good. Goodish. Goodish enough. All right. Then let's start with Al-Ghazali then. Let's turn to our next thinker. I don't know if we're going to finish with him today. We might, but we might need a little bit more time, and if we do, that's fine. We can continue talking about him a little bit more on Tuesday. All right, so let me give you a little bit of background about who Al-Ghazali is first before we actually start talking about this book, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. So Al-Ghazali is a bit later. He's 11th and 12th century. So it's about a century after Al-Farabi was writing. In his own lifespan, Al-Ghazali gets called the preserver of the Islamic faith. In his own lifetime, he's already being called this. Not the creator of the Islamic faith, obviously. He's not doing that, right? But he's the preserver of it insofar as it had fallen into sort of misunderstandings and ruination. And it is Al-Ghazali who's the one who puts it back on the right track. Right? Who sort of resets it back to the way that it should have been. How does he do this? All kinds of different ways. I mean, let me just give you, he's basically the reason why the Sufi practice gets accepted within the Islamic world. right? And gives it, and we'll talk about that a little bit about what I mean by the Sufi mystical practice. It's that the foundation of everything that he's doing is this sort of Sufi mystical practice. He argues against all kinds of mistaken interpretations of Islam. Indeed, there are some of them that he so thoroughgoingly destroys that I can't even, that we don't even know what they are anymore. We only know his critique of them, right? Because the traditions themselves are so thoroughgoingly annihilated by him that nothing survives the traditions besides his annihilating them. He also effectively destroys the Philosophes. These we were talking about last time, right? These are these Islamic theologians who utilize Plato and Aristotle to articulate Islamic belief. He doesn't like Al-Farabi that much, though Al-Farabi is not his primary target. It's actually the person who comes after Al-Farabi, a successor, Ibn Sina, who is his predominant target, and he thoroughgoingly, again, carpet bombs and annihilates Ibn Sina as well. And to the extent that the practice of these Philosophes is almost entirely gone in the Islamic world after him. Not entirely. We talk about this a lot more in Islamic philosophy, and indeed, saying that we get rid of the Philosophes doesn't mean that philosophy disappears from the Islamic world, right? But it's at least not explicitly put in terms of the Greeks, in terms of pagan thought after him. And the last thing that he does is he writes the book that we're reading. That's the last thing that he does to win this sort of acclaim. This book is enormous. So I sent you a PDF of the first chapter. The first chapter is over 100 pages, and there are 40 chapters. So this book is about 4,000 pages. It's enormous. It's massive. Most of it has not been translated into English. Some pieces of it have been, but most of it has actually not been translated into English. I am told, again, this is sort of secondhand, but I've at least been told that in the Islamic world, this is the most widely read book today after the Quran. Now, how do you measure that sort of thing? I don't know. It's very important still to this day, at the very least, right? We don't need necessarily the superlative of it. But at the very least, this book remains very important to this day, especially in the Sunni world. He's a Sunni thinker. And this book is especially important among Sunni thinkers. So he's a big deal. He was a big deal in his own lifetime, and time has done nothing to make him less of a big deal. Right? He remains just as important as he sort of ever was as a thinker. I love him in the same way that Nietzsche loves his beautiful enemy. I really don't like his actual philosophical account at all, but I really think it's he's a worthwhile foil. And I actually, medieval philosophy, when I teach that class, it's basically centered around him. He's the very middle of the class. As this sort of like foe and foil for me to try to sort of philosophically overcome with Platonism. Because he's got this wildly different, very well articulated account that's got a case. He's got a real case. It's a really interesting, really good account. So I absolutely love him. And hate him at the same time, right? Love him in that way. Love him in the way you love the rival that pushes you to become better. We're not going to do most of that today. That's not going to be our target. There's really not going to be much of his philosophical works at all. Again, take medieval philosophy if you want. We can do all that there. What we're going to focus on today is really just a table of contents of the revival of the religious science. That's basically all I want to talk about today, is just a table of contents. And there'll be so much to talk about just there. it's going to be enough. I also want us to try and figure out why the book is called The Revival, not the Revival of Religion. Why is he calling this the revival of the religious science? And sciences, in fact, it's plural. Why is it the revival of the religious sciences? Why are we calling religion a science? That's what we're literally doing, right? We're obviously then not in the realm where there's going to be a conflict between religion and science if we're talking about the religious science. So what does that possibly mean? What does he mean by religion? And I want us to just try to notice everything that he's talking about as being included within this religious science. I'll say a little bit about why he disagrees with Al-Farabi about the status of philosophy. It's not in the reading. It's stuff that would be from other places with him. I'll also talk a little bit about that today too. Why he's so, but basically he thinks he gives tradition a different sort of status than Al-Farabi does. We won't be able to fully explain why today, but he's got some reasons, and I'll at least point in the direction of his promotion of following the tradition as being the most rational thing. That basically is his stance. Is that actually, rather than trying to like figure out everything about the truth with yourself, you can't do that. You're better off actually sort of following authoritative teachers. And he thinks it's more rational to do that. I'll try to at least give you the rough hint of what that argument looks like today, but we won't. Again, that's medieval philosophy. We won't be able to fully do it today. Our target's really just going to be, what is this religious science, and what does it mean to revive it as well? Why does it need a revival, and what would it mean to revive it? So that's our goal for today. Any initial sort of thoughts or questions, things people noticed, anything anyone wanted to ask about just from the text before we sort of dive into it? All right, then let's start diving into it a little bit. All right. He tells us straight away is what the purpose of the religious science is. What is it? It is the science of happiness. Now, as far as he's concerned, what is the true, let's use that Al-Farabi language, what is true happiness according to Al-Ghazali? True happiness, according to Al-Ghazali, is attained in the afterlife. There may well indeed be sort of false religious sciences or false religious accounts of human happiness, ones that don't lead to successful attainment of happiness in the afterlife, right? So what is Christianity then? Though it's better than many, indeed, what is atheism? Atheism is an even worse. False or misleading science. One that gets it even more wrong. But they're both religious sciences in an extent, right? And indeed, he's imagining less and less coherent ones, right? Because his claim is certainly going to be that Islam is the most rational of all the religions, right? What does that mean? Then we get more and more incoherent the farther down we sort of get, right? Ones that are just lead you farther and farther away from happiness and get happiness longer and longer with time. Right? So indeed, all of these things then are religion too, because religion just is the science of happiness. Okay. So what is this science sort of concerned with? Right? All right. What the science or science is, because there could be different parts of the science. What do? They prescribe a way of life that if people follow this way of life, they will attain happiness. And again, this should be reminding us very much of what Al-Farabi was saying. All right. So let's pause for a second before we go any further. This phrase, way of life. What does this phrase mean to you all? What is a way of life? What is your way of life? Does it mean anything? Because this is going to be an important one. William, go ahead. Oh. You moved for some reason. Okay, try again. Go ahead.
All right, cool. To me, way of life is sort of like your beliefs put into practice, into the real world. Like all of your sort of, or maybe not even beliefs, just all of your internalized ideals get translated into your actual actions, and
good.
That becomes sort of your way of living.
That's right. Yeah. So it's going to have something to do with actual action, right? And it's also going to have something to do with belief. There's going to be some kind of connection between the two, right? That your beliefs will sort of bleed into your actions, and presumably your actions will also then in turn bleed into your beliefs in various sorts of ways. Good. That's a good start. We got in the chat someone suggesting a way of life is sort of the boundaries or values that you sort of practice or keep in your life. That seems good. Okay, do any of you know, define your way of life for me? Do you know what it is? Can you tell me what your way of life is? Then, can you describe it for me? My guess is probably not. My guess is most of the things you would describe to me, if you had to, you would describe more your lifestyle, right? You'd be like, oh yeah, I get up in the morning, I eat some food, then I go to class, and I'm going to class so that I can get a good job afterwards, right? Like, you'd be more describing like your lifestyle. You'd be like, oh, I play a lot of video games. I'm a gamer. But that's not a way of life, right? That's actually one very relatively narrow portion of what it is that you do or are or believe or think. Another thing that makes it super weird is that a lot of the things that are actually part of your way of life, you probably aren't even articulating it necessarily as beliefs that you could ever think anything differently about. So it would be hard for you to articulate them. For example, I imagine all of you agree that it will be really beneficial for everyone, good for everyone, if the gross domestic product goes up, and if you had more money. Having more money is good, right? You all probably believe this, right? I don't think you know why you believe it. I don't think you could actually give me a really that clear of an account. I mean, you would come up with one if I put you on the spot. If I was like, why do you believe this? You'll come up with something, right? But your belief is actually way more fundamental than that. It's actually sort of prior to the explanations you'll come up with to justify it. It's more the framework through which you see and navigate the world. As part of that is this assumption that it's always better to have more money, right? And so when Al-Ghazali is going to come along and say, like, actually, you should try to be as poor as possible. I mean, not exactly what he's going to say, but let's say he was going to say, no, you should try to be as poor as possible. You'd be like, wait, what? It's not even a belief you think that you hold. It's more like the foundational framework that you use to actually navigate the world. Like, it's almost like deeper than a belief or more fundamental than a belief. Last class, I was sort of describing this in the way that, like, the Disney movie you watched when you were 5 probably shaped how you see the world more than anything I could ever possibly say. On this sort of like just visceral level, what should the world look and feel like? Right? All of that too is part of this way of life that Al-Ghazali is talking about. Indeed, a better question might be, what's not part of the way of life that Al-Ghazali is going to be talking about? And the answer is going to be nothing. The true religious science is the one that will prescribe to you a way of life that will address every single aspect of your life. And if you follow this way of life in every single part of your life, you will indeed attain happiness. And if you don't, you won't. Right? That's why this is a revival. When he says that the science has fallen into disarray, it's amongst other Muslims. That's who it has fallen into disarray before, right? People say they are Muslims, people say they are following the religious science, but are not actually following it. And hence, the Islamic world is in disarray. The Islamic world is in disorder, especially because those who are most of all sort of responsible for ensuring that people follow this way of life, the rulers of the Islamic community, they themselves are in the dark as to the true religious science. And so whether they're doing it purposefully or otherwise, they are themselves leading the average person into disarray as well by not promoting the right behaviors, the right actions, the right beliefs, the right values, the right internal states, everything else. Right? This is this right, and so this is why the religious science needs to be revived. Right? The revival here, we need to more clearly articulate what way of life is actually posited by Islam, so that we who are Muslims, we who call ourselves Muslims, can follow it. This book is not in any sense intended for the non-Muslim audience. Right? The non-Muslim audience presumably would not agree that the Islamic life is the best way of life, and so therefore will not get anything out of the book. Right? Because he's not trying to defend that claim here. He's not trying to defend Islam against atheism or Islam against Christians or whatever. What he's trying to do is to articulate how can we all be Muslim correctly in a way that actually gets at the goal of being Muslim, which was human happiness. How can we do this well? Right? And the novel thing that he's going to do is to extend this sort of science into every single part of life. That's why I want to just talk about the table of contents of this 4,000-page book. Like, I almost just want to get over like how many things Islam, properly considered, prescribes. And when we're done, yeah, Islam's going to be the same thing as politics, and it's going to be the same thing as philosophy, and it's going to be the same thing as ethics, and it's going to be the same thing as science, and it's just going to be life. Islam is going to be life itself, the life that is lived by the Muslim. And then you either fail at living that life well or poorly. And he thinks the same thing is true about Christianity, right? Christianity is a way of life that is lived, just a less coherent one, and atheism an even less coherent one, right? An even more incoherent way to live. But they are all religions. They are all ways of totalizing ways of life, right? That cover and address every single aspect of it. And maybe when we're done, we talked about a little bit about this last class, but maybe when we're done a little bit, actually like talk about like what actually is the American way of life. It's Christian-ish. It's got some Christian elements to it, but it's got a lot of other stuff going on in it too. And if we actually try to articulate it, what is the way of life that Americans live, that all of us are living? Al-Ghazali is just going to say, we're going to discover it's incoherent. And that's not actually a good way of life. One that's not actually leading us to the goal that we sort of want. All right. So that's my little introduction. Again, any questions or thoughts on it or anything? Or should we just, literally, I just want to go through the table of contents almost line by line and just talk about like how much he's including in this religious science. All right. Good so far? All right. So let's start breaking it down. What are the parts of the religious science? Right. Here's what it will tell us. Let's just go sort of step by step. First, what it will tell us about is it'll tell us about knowledge. And this is basically what I sent you out, this 150 page or so text. It's basically chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about knowledge. Okay? So what's it going to tell us about knowledge? Okay. It should tell us about why knowledge is important, how it should be valued, how knowledge should be used to attain happiness, how it should not be used, and how it should be praised. This last one's really important. This was also in Al-Farabi too. And we don't tend to think about it in our society that much. What does our society teach us to praise? It's super weird, right? Like, we all do praise similar things, right? Like, who gets praised? The great athlete gets praised. Right? Or the person who makes a lot of money gets praised. Do we praise politicians? Actually, no. Our society teaches us not to particularly praise politicians. Indeed, it actually teaches us to speak poorly about politicians. Weirdly. Right? Who else? Lawyers. Do we praise lawyers? We don't, but we all secretly want to be lawyers or at least have a really good one. Do we praise learning? No, of course not. No. No one's arguing that school is essential. That's not one of the praises. Yeah. Someone wrote in, yeah, we praise the badass guy. Absolutely right. The action hero or whatever. Sure, right? Why did anyone ever come to me and say, now make sure you really praise Clint Eastwood in the Dirty Harry movies, right? No. But nevertheless, somehow we've all been taught to praise certain things, blame other things. Al-Ghazali thinks that one of the real dangers, and this is a recurrent thing, he thinks that nothing does more harm to Islam than basically the idiots who practice Islam. Do more damage to it than anything else, and that the Islamic world does not properly praise the pursuit of knowledge. And so indeed, one of the things that we will talk about in this first chapter at enormous length, this is what I had you just, the part of it that I had you read, him just going through the Quran line by line by line, being like, here's all the places that the Quran says knowledge is more important than anything else. And indeed, why would we praise this? Because what does he mean by knowledge? Knowledge is the study of the religious science. It's what Al-Farabi was calling philosophy. He's not going to call it philosophy, and he doesn't think philosophy is the preeminent way that we acquire this knowledge. But nevertheless, what Al-Farabi was calling knowledge, that's what Al-Ghazali is calling knowledge here too, right? It's how we'll get the religious science right. And we'll need to do this if we're going to properly identify human happiness. The reason why Muslims have fallen, other members of the community have fallen short, is because they have somehow gotten confused about what happiness actually is. They think happiness is to be found in making a lot of money, or in having a harem, or in conquering neighboring nations, or all these various sorts of things, that is not, in fact, what happiness consists within. And because they've gotten it wrong, they rule their own lives wrong, and then the whole community as a whole has been ruled wrong. Right? So knowledge is sort of indeed the first thing that this religious science will indeed study and prescribe and tell us how to use. Right? We shouldn't use it the same. There are going to be limits to it, right? But this is indeed the starting point. Right? Next thing, faith. That's the next thing the religious science is going to tell us about, or belief. You could translate the word either way. What is this going to be about? All right, it will tell us what beliefs should we have, what beliefs are foundational for being a Muslim. That's why the faith word is built in here too, and it's a fine translation. Right? What is the sort of baseline that everyone who is going to be a Muslim needs to meet in order to remain a Muslim? Otherwise, right, like when he's attacking the philosophes, he's not actually attacking them because they're using pagan philosophy. He doesn't care if pagans are pagans. That just like sucks to be pagans, that they believe stupid things. What he cares about is Muslims who don't believe in the things that you need to believe in order to be a Muslim. that's going to distort the Islamic world and then cause the way of life to become worse, right? So we need to identify what are the core beliefs, right? We also need to figure out, though, what are the beliefs that don't especially matter. Or what are ones that we can disagree about but still remain Muslims? When he's attacking these other Islamic sects, he wants to be really clear to distinguish just saying that they're wrong or saying that they're un-Islamic. There's a big difference between the two, right? He can think, oh yeah, the Talamids, they're wrong, but they're still Muslims at least, right? Versus no, some of the Falsafs, Ibn Sina, he's not only is he wrong, he's not even a Muslim anymore, right? He's wrong about things that really fundamentally matter. So we need to identify what beliefs matter, what beliefs don't. Again, I think this is true of us. I think there are some beliefs that we think really matter, and that if someone didn't hold the belief, you would have a hard time interacting with them. Whereas others, yeah, it's fun to fight about or fun to disagree about, right? But if your neighbor's like, I'm pro-murder, I think you got a problem, right? You're probably not going to get along with that neighbor, right? Or indeed, if your neighbor is like, yeah, I don't think it would be a big deal if, I'm trying to come up with one that's not actually controversial. Let me actually do a controversial one. The reason why there's increasing polarization in the United States is that there's an increasing disagreement about what those beliefs that actually matter are. Right? That's why there would indeed, because indeed that would really matter, right? Like if like I prefer Keynesian economics and you prefer a Friedman-style supply-side economics, in the 80s, that would have been a disagreement. We would have differed about economic policy as a result of that, but we probably wouldn't have gone into the streets and started brawling over it, right? Because it's not that fun. It doesn't matter to being an American that you really believe one versus the other. Now, like the sort of disagreements have become the fundamental things that actually potentially are indeed separating disagreements about what it actually means to be an American itself. That kind of polarization is not going to be easily avoided. Lincoln, go ahead. You had a hand up.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if the contents of this book are organized according to like a specific hierarchy. Like, does he think that knowledge per se has like priority over belief or over like the things that make us like that are good for our lives or the things that are bad for our lives? Like, is there a structure to it, or is it all just like these are the tenets that I think are important? This is why.
There is a structure to it, but it's not necessarily a hierarchical one. It's more structured by almost like your engagement as a theoretical being in the world, your engagement as sort of a practical being in the world, and then your sort of engagement with yourself sort of as like an inner being, like how you sort of internally relate to yourself as yourself. Okay, so it's cool. That's more, and his ultimate goal is going to be to say that all of these are internally related, so that if you're doing the theoretical thing right, you will necessarily then be doing the practical thing right, and then be orienting yourself right. So that's why it's not really hierarchical exactly. All of them are sort of equally important. In a different book, he actually says, through the Sufi practice, what you realize is, through the sort of Sufi mystical experience, you discover just how perfect the Quran is, and that not a single word in it should be changed. Right? And that, like, so like, even the like smallest of little details, like we're going to pray 3 times a day to Mecca, you discover that that's not just any minor little detail. That detail is just as important in a sense as we shall worship no other God but Allah. Like that they're almost like part and part. They mean almost the same thing. They sort of entail one another at the highest level, even if you don't necessarily know it. So it's not hierarchical, but there is a structure. So is that?
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Excellent. Good. Nick, go ahead.
You spoke to it a little bit, but is this kind of why in the Islamic faith, nearly everything that is done for a religious purpose? Like you said, praying 3 times a day, but I think even how like they eat and how they do any kind of practice, it is religious.
We're getting there. Yes, we're going to get to food. How you eat is indeed one of the things that the religious science will properly prescribe. Yeah. Just make sure that just make sure that when you say is religious, you don't mean in this Western sense, you just mean it's part of your way of life. Because
Yeah.
of course how you eat is part of your way of life. You want to start a fight. I mean, I don't know if, I think someone said they were from Texas in here. So I'm going to start a fight right now. Does chili have beans in it? Okay, there's no Texans. Apparently, I was wrong that there's someone from Texas here because no one's like started firebombing the Zoom chat, right? Like how you eat is very much part of your way of life, right? And how you sleep and how you pray. I mean, and so indeed, of course, all of those things are going to be religious, right? The question more is, what are we doing with all of these things? If this is right, if this is the right way of understanding religion, what are we doing with how we eat? Does how we fit with how we go to work or how we worship or, you know, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Does that help? That work?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Awesome. Good. Good. Any others? All right, let's keep going. We're still on the theoretical side, so let's keep going with with this sort of your theoretical life. How you're living your theoretical life. What are some other parts of that? I'll go a little bit faster because we could spend a long time with all of these, but there are what he calls the sort of mysterious things. Right? Sort of mysterious actions. These are actions that are sort of revealed to us through direct revelation and that otherwise we wouldn't have had access to them. Right, and so these are sort of the ones that he lists are basically these like sort of like 5 principal sort of daily practices that are commanded in the Quran that are otherwise quite mysterious. Why the specific ones that he points? So there's sort of purity, like sort of maintaining certain kinds of purity rituals in certain kinds of ways, certain prayer practices like that I pray longer in the morning than in the evening, and that I should be facing Mecca when I pray, and yada, yada, yada. Almsgiving, basically giving to the poor, this sort of centrality of this practice. Fasting during feast times like Ramadan, which is actually today, I believe today is actually the first day of Ramadan. So, and going on a pilgrimage. And the importance of going on pilgrimages, right? These are things that you're not going to figure these things out by yourself. These are things that are sort of the result of authority. And the fundamental reason why, or the fundamental, let's say, disagreement between Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali is about the ability of human beings to rationally discover truth for themselves. Al-Farabi thinks human beings are capable of discovering the truth about things for themselves, including truth about God, truths about ethics, truth about politics. Al-Farabi just thinks we can discover all of that. That's what he's calling philosophy. Right? And he's getting this from Platonism, right? From this sort of this Neoplatonic philosophy. In Al-Ghazali, he's just way more suspicious about what human beings are capable of discovering on the basis of their own rationality. So a lot of things that he's going to call knowledge are the result of tradition. They're the result of a certain, what he calls infallible teachers, where Muhammad is sort of the archetypical infallible teacher, because God was directly speaking through Muhammad, right? So he thinks we are indeed dependent upon authority to reach knowledge about the world, right? And this is one of the sort of preeminent ways, or one of the predominant ways in which this is the case. However, it's worth mentioning that when he talks about authority and revelation, you too could become an authority, or at least attain a kind of revelation yourself, again, through Sufi mystical practice. All right. So as a Sufi mystic, you're not going to learn everything that Muhammad himself knew. But basically, the way he puts it in a different book about Sufism is that what you realize through Sufi mystical practice is just how more infallible Muhammad's authority is than anything you could ever possibly like imagine for yourself. And so you realize just how right he is about everything, but you're not the same level of authority. You don't become a prophet yourself as a result of this, but you at least like sort of understand the why of everything that it is that Muhammad himself said. So we don't just have to read the Quran. We had to read the Quran to actually make the Sufi mystical practice now, right? We weren't capable of figuring out the Sufi mystical practice on our own. But if you want to do more than just accept authority, that path is open to you. But if you're not going to be a Sufi mystic, stop complaining that things are just demanded of you, because there is another path you could take. Otherwise, then the rational thing is to just accept what your tradition actually says. Again, that's a very sketchy kind of summary of that position. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's at least a sort of the sketchy summary. Basically, he's offering an argument to sort of articulate the limitation of the human capacity to discover the truth for themselves, and so therefore the necessity of us to sort of rely upon trustworthy authority figures and trustworthy traditions to arrive at truth. Other things that are in this sort of knowledge part of your theoretical life is discussion of scripture. What does scripture say? How should scripture be used? How should it not be used? Right? What do I do with it? How do I make use of it in the course of my life? And then lastly, we talk about sort of the, how political organization should be structured. And you might have seen in the reading a lot of talk of what he calls jurisprudence. This talk of jurisprudence is basically the main, or the highest, I guess. Let me actually start over again. The two highest kinds of learning in the Islamic world are what are called, on the one hand, theology, and on the other hand, jurisprudence. So theology is sort of like the study of Allah and the structure of reality that follows from Allah, and jurisprudence is figuring out how to instantiate the Sharia. So you've all probably heard the term Sharia law, which is a little bit like saying ATM machine. Like it's sort of like Sharia is just a word that means law. So it's just like Sharia law is sort of oxymoron. The Sharia is the law that the law of God himself. And if you know the natural law tradition, this would be the equivalent of divine law or natural law. And then how that gets, the jurisprudence is figuring out how to apply God's law into concrete human laws, right? Through something that's called the fiqh. And the jurisprudence is basically figuring out like how should human laws be organized to best reflect divine law. So jurisprudence would be an example of one of these sort of highest theoretical parts of life, engaging in this activity of how should we structure our legal code such that it sort of reflects divine law in some sense. And this too would be part of this sort of theoretical organization. All right. So this is the first 1,000 pages of the book here. Go ahead, Lincoln.
So jurisprudence is only something that can be engaged in by the elite of society, right? Like it's not something that would be like kind of a uniform part of society.
I mean, though again, it's important to note that like anyone in principle could do it, right? Like but yes, you need learning for it at the very least, right? It's like what you would do, you'd go to the university and what you would learn mostly is jurisprudence, actually. That's what most people would go to universities to learn. So it's not supposed to be classist exactly in the sense that like you have to be rich to do it or something. You just need to be learned to do it. Now, of course, in practice, right, it's way easier to get learned if you have lots of money, right? Or if you have political influence, obviously. But at least in principle, anyway, it's open to anyone who has the skills to do it, and then who goes on and acquires the learning necessary to do it.
I feel like it sort of speaks to like those two different speeds of religion that we were talking about with Catholicism.
Very much so. Yep. Very much so. I mean, even the layperson should have an appropriate understanding of what the law is, what the law says, in some sense. But yeah, the average layperson's probably not going to be engaged in jurisprudence itself. And this is actually a really cool point. I actually haven't said this yet, so actually thank you for you're reminding me of something really important. Not every member of society needs to have every part of the religious science. Right? What's important is that the Islamic community as a whole properly have all of them. And the ones that are especially, oh, go ahead. Yeah, what were you gonna say? Sorry.
It's like more kind of about fulfilling like your role and your part in society, like, and contributing to the greater whole than having everybody in society like follow this strict code.
Yeah, everyone is, particularly these first ones, so the first 10 basically. Yeah, the theoretical ones, those are ones that are not going to be available to everyone. And indeed, if you are not suited for engaging in Quranic interpretation, don't engage in Quranic interpretation. It's the quickest way to end up in hell. Right? But because you're going to do a bad job of it, and like, so you're going to blaspheme way worse than if you just said nothing at all. But it's important that some people be engaging in Quranic interpretation, and that those people be getting it right. That they be using it in the right way, and that they be deriving the right lessons from it, and they not be doing the wrong things with it. So this is a really good point that you're pointing out that I sort of missed, I guess, in this. You're exactly right. Not all of these sciences need to be practiced by everyone. Now the next set, actually the next 3 sets, everyone should do the next 3 sets, but the theoretical ones in particular, not everyone will be doing all of it. That's absolutely right. Well, it just matters that the community have all of this in there, so that then the people making the laws are making the right laws, right? Or the people who are reporting what the Quran says to the average person are reporting the right things, reporting it in the right way. So that's a very good and very important point.
Thanks.
Good. Any other comments before we turn to practical life? All right, then let's turn to the parts of practical life. So we've done the parts of theoretical life. We've done basically what I believe and how I believe. Now let's talk about practical life. Right? How should I eat? Because eating is indeed a crucial part of life. So how should I do it? How should I do it in such a way? Let's make it really clear what the question is here. How should I eat such that by eating, I get closer to the ultimate goal of human happiness? I'm not just gonna like sit down and have a burger, right? Like, how can I sit down and have that burger to get me closer to the actual goal of life? Similarly, how should I marry? How should I work? Again, so the same, just add the same sort of qualification, right? Like, how should I work such that by working, I am getting closer to the ultimate goal of happiness? How should I relate to law? And this is something everyone needs to know, right? Because here I'm not talking about writing the laws myself. I'm not doing jurisprudence. But how should I relate to the laws that are given? Should I be like my brother-in-law? So my brother-in-law, his goal, without doing anything illegal, is to skate as close to the edge of doing something illegal as possible, but still not violate the law, right? Get as much as I can, squeeze as close as I can. Is that how I should relate to the law? Is that what I should try to do? Right? It's tax season, right? Should I not lie on my taxes, but come as close as possible to lying on my taxes? Or should I stand in a different relationship? And indeed, as you would probably imagine, no, that is not the correct relationship that I should stand the law. Right? Because again, particularly law meaning Islamic law, because there's no other law, right? Law, how should the political organizations be structured? That's part of the political science, right? So obviously then I should have a far more reverential relationship to the law rather than just trying to sort of, just avoid breaking it. We've also got, how should I relate to other people? Here's a weird one. There's particularly a weird one given our current climate. When should I remain solitary? And when should I go out in public? How can I use solitude when I am solitary? For the human good. And how can I use being in public when I'm in public for the public good? There's actually a really important part of Al-Ghazali's own sort of personal story when he gives his own biography at one point. And this is a really part of his own life. He had been engaged in public teaching for a really long time. And eventually he began to suspect that he was missing something fundamentally important from his religious life, that he was too public. He wasn't attending to sort of a solitary life, and that what he needed to do was leave teaching and lead a solitary life for like 10 years. Sort of a private life for 10 years as an important part of his sort of spiritual development, as an important part of becoming better. And indeed, it is during this time that he actually discovers the Sufi practice. He discovers the Sufi practice during this sort of 10-year period of solitude. And again, it's not exactly like solitude in the sense of like being all alone, like his wife and kids went with him, but like being not in the public sphere, being in the private sphere rather than the public sphere. Does Ghazali, so we got a question here in the chat, does Al-Ghazali separate these laws by gender? I mean, in a sense, yes, but in a sense, no. Like, every person, regardless of their gender, needs to be answering this question, right? Every person, regardless of gender, needs to be answering this question. Some parts of the answer, the marriage one maybe is a good one to have highlighted there, I guess. Some parts of the answer might well differ for different genders. Other parts might not differ for different genders, right? I mean, probably how we eat probably isn't going to vary that much. Maybe how we get married maybe will vary more, right? Or maybe work in particular maybe will vary more, right? But I would say the broad framework here, I mean, basically what he's laying down is this framework this is just the framework of the parts of human life. That's what I'm hoping we're sort of getting a sense of, right? Like any quote unquote religion is going to have to talk about all of these things if it's a way of life, because these are just the parts of life. And if your religion doesn't talk about all of these things, you've probably misidentified what your religion actually is. Your religion probably isn't what you thought it was on this model that Al-Ghazali is laying out. Your religion probably isn't Christianity if Christianity does not indeed relate to how you go about working. Something else is your religion, something else is your way of life, if it's not Christianity that tells you how I should go to work. If it's not Christianity that's telling you how you should eat, then something's gone deeply wrong. You're not a Christian. Something else is your way of life. Or your way of life's just incoherent. And you're a Christian in some parts of your life and not a Christian in other parts of your life. And then again, maybe your way of life is just completely incoherent, or maybe there's some underlying way of life that's more fundamental. Some Americanism or something. So I hope that was helpful to the religious question, or the gendered question. I don't want to, in any sense, pretend that Al-Ghazali is not doing gendered practices by any stretch of the imagination. But the important thing to note here for sort of the broader analysis is that it's not going to change the question, even if the answer is different for genders. The question is these are just the questions that you need to have an answer to in the course of living your life. And all of us, in fact, do have answers to these questions, even if we have never thought about them, and even if they're really bad answers. You all eat in a particular way. Most likely, you have not spent a great deal of time thinking if you're eating in the right way, but you eat in a particular way. So you have an answer to this question. Okay? And it's the same for everything else. The same for all these other sort of questions, too. Let me go through the last of these sort of practical ones. We're getting a little bit out of time, but that's fine if we need to go over. How should I travel? One of the most important virtues in the Islamic world is being a good host. I went to Kuwait for a conference once, and I was treated, and it was very important to everyone there as someone coming from incredibly far away that they helped me travel well, that they sort of helped me inhabit this space that I was not familiar with in a good way, that they made my experience really well. This is true, and again, this is true in most cultures besides Western Europe. Actually, Western Europe is the one that probably minimizes travel relationships more than any others. And then lastly, how should I imitate my ancestors or the prophets or the founders of society? In our case, this would be how do I relate to George Washington, right, or Thomas Jefferson? So this is sort of practical life. These are sort of my daily sort of behaviors. But again, this too is not exhaustive of what my life contains. What else is there? There's also my inner life. How should I be oriented inside of myself? The Islamic word for this is heart. How should I internally relate to what happens to me externally? And so what are some examples here? How should I relate, to example, to lust? How can I avoid being ruled by gluttony? How can I avoid anger and hatred? And again, he's giving all of this, so in terms of avoiding these things, right, he's obviously giving the Islamic answer, but we could reword all of these questions slightly. How do I relate to these things? To make it a sort of a broader framework, right? So obviously, within the Islamic framework, how do I relate from to lust? I should try to avoid it, right? But to make it more broad, right? How do I relate to lust? Because you're going to have some relationship to it. How do I relate to gluttony, to hatred? Okay. How do I relate to the good things of the world? Right? And by good things, he means, for example, wealth, honor, pride, and beauty. Right? How do I avoid becoming greedy? How do I avoid becoming pompous? How do I avoid becoming, vainglorious? How do I avoid becoming vain? Conversely, perhaps, how do I properly repent? How do I relate to repenting of wrongdoing? Because everyone's going to engage in wrongdoing. So how do I relate to that properly? How do I become patient? To fear or hope? How about the poverty? Or, money in general. How do I relate to ascetic practices? Practices where I deliberately deny myself things for the sake of something else. And if you say, oh, I don't have any ascetic practices. If you've gone to the gym, congratulations, you have ascetic practices. Because when you go to the gym, you cause yourself pain for the sake of some long-term benefit. Okay? So you have a ascetic practice, a practice of self-denial. You might not be a Sufi, right? You might not be spending 40 days in a cave in a desert, right? But you have an ascetic practice. This is something you will need to have an orientation to in a relationship toward. And again, let's just finish it up because we're near the end of class. And with all, I'm hoping my basic point is obvious here at this point, right? How do I realize a kind of mystical union to God? Right? And again, one answer to how do I relate to God might be denying that there is one. Right? But how do I relate to God? To love? To being truthful? There's all kinds of times when it would be very convenient to lie. Should I? How do I examine my own life? Here's a weird one. how do I do a proper job evaluating the way it is that I'm actually living? Because it's really easy to flatter yourself and be like, oh, I'm living great. I'm doing everything right. How do I avoid that? How do I get an accurate assessment of how it is that I'm actually living? One that's neither too critical, because it's also easy to just beat the hell out of yourself. How do I avoid that? But also, how do I avoid flattering myself? How do I gain a proper self-assessment of myself? Okay? And indeed, this is a radically important task. Right? How do I relate to things like meditation? And ultimately, how do I relate to the inevitable, to my own death? The religious science, so Islam as the true religious science as far as Al-Ghazali is concerned, right? It answers all of these questions, right? It gives us ways of relating to all of these things, but any way of navigating the world is going to have to answer all of these questions. Even if you're going to relate to the inevitability of your own death by trying your damnedest to never think about it until you are on your deathbed, that is a way of relating to your death. Okay? Even if you relate to ascetic practices by mocking them, like Luther does, that is a way of relating to ascetic practices. Okay? Wealth, poverty, you are going to have to be related. You are going to necessarily be related to all of these things in some way. I think Al-Ghazali's basic sense is that everyone has a way of life, which is to say that everyone has a religion. So if you go about and pretend you don't have one, and you demand of them, he says in various places, if someone were to come to me and demand that I justify why I accept the reports of Muhammad, I will turn to that person and respond, well, I don't know, why do you accept whatever nonsense it is you believe? I accept the words of Muhammad because I've studied them exhaustively and engaged in various kinds of mystical pursuits that have shown me that they are true. Why do you believe whatever nonsense you believe? Why do you live whatever crazy way it is that you're living? Right? And he says, and they will not answer me. They will not have an answer. People indeed, by and large, haven't put a great deal of thought into how it is that they are living. Right? But we are always living some way. Religion, and this is the sense in which what he's saying isn't really that different from Al-Farabi. Religion is how we as a society go about organizing and orienting ourselves in the world. Right? That's what I was calling this way of life. Heidegger calls this a fundamental attunement, for what it's worth, if anyone knows that way. How we are attuned in the world. Right? That is what a religion is. That does not depend upon any particular beliefs about transcendence. Okay? Maybe the proper way to be oriented to the world is to deny that there is any transcendence whatsoever. But Nietzsche's got a way of life. And he's pushing one, and in his case, quite clearly, he's trying to articulate a particular way of life the way that he wants humans to live. Right? It is an atheistic way of life. That does not make it not a religion by this sort of criteria that are being laid out here. Right? It is a fundamental orientation toward the world. It is not in any sense, notice, there's nothing irrational about this as far as Al-Ghazali is concerned, right? Knowledge is an important part of it. How you relate to knowledge is an important part of it. And indeed, his stance is really clear. Like, we'll talk, if you take medieval with me, we'll go into this in great depth. He just thinks, like, you're dumb if you're not a Muslim. Like, he thinks it's the rational choice to make. It's the obvious choice to make. And you don't need any, like, special faith in anything above and beyond the kind of special faith you need to decide anything at all in the world. Like, his basic sense is you're all trusting someone about something. He's just doing it explicitly, and he knows why he's trusting them. Right? The rest of you are just trusting someone about something and don't know why. Right? And that's his critique of the philosophers. He thinks they just are too wedded to Plato and Aristotle. They trust Plato and Aristotle too much. Why trust Plato and Aristotle more than Muhammad? That's the way he sort of articulates this argument. Right? So all of that's really specific to Islam. But again, now let's take that out from the specificity of Islam for a second. Right? This claim that all of us indeed have a way of life is inarguable. And the claim that religion is the way of life of a people, this is not an uncompelling way of characterizing the world. It fits the way that religion has been talked about human history way more than the sort of Christian-inspired way of defining it in terms of transcendence does. because everyone has different ways of life. Not everyone has any particular stance about transcendence at all. For example, Confucians. It's just not really a big metaphysics isn't really a thing Confucians do that much. Right? But it's very clearly articulating a way of life. And if that's the phenomenon of religion, right, that this is giving us a very different talk. Again, leave the specificities of Islam behind. This is giving us a very different way of talking and thinking about what it is that religions are. A different framework for describing them and describing the world than the sort of transcendence model that Taylor was articulating. All right. Oh, looks like I've kept us over a little bit. So, okay, that's it for today. I think do you want to spend any more time with Al-Ghazali? Do you all feel reasonably good about it? Do you think additional time would be useful? We can spend more time on it if we want to have to rush a little bit there at the end. Otherwise, we can just turn to doing some stuff with Buddhism next week if that works for people. So no vote from Al-Ghazali. Right. Then we'll turn to Buddhism next time. Buddhism similarly is going to sort of, it's not going to necessarily be exactly the same. I mean, Buddhists, we're going to see, are going to be like sort of characteristically unconcerned with actually defining what a religion is. The Buddhist response to is Buddhism as a religion is going to be like, what do you mean by a religion? We don't really care what you call us. But the way in which they sort of go about responding to that, so I have a quick little article that I have for us to read next time. We'll do a real quick one, and then we'll use that as a springboard for a larger discussion. Just sort of talking about how all this relates in the context of Buddhism. It won't be the same as in Islam, but it's not going to be it's going to be closer to what's being said in the Islamic world than again to, I think, the sort of Christian or Christian-inspired portrayals. All right. Thank you all very much. Sorry we ran a little bit late today, so sorry about that. Hope you all have a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.